got a little bit of time together, and some of you may have your Bibles prepared to do some marking. So let's do another chunk of Jeremiah. I think as we sit down together and just whittle away, somebody said to me, gosh, that Jeremiah seems so very depressing. You read it and it just, is there anything good that he's going to say? And the answer is yes. But you've got to look at the whole concept, and there's things from a bird's eye view that I even left my Post-its in here. You can always tell where I've been. Post-its are left behind. If you will, I've made you label the 5th chapter. If you remember what we did, I had you label the 5th chapter. I'm going to have you label a portion of the 4th chapter. And I say a portion because I'm dividing it. Well, actually, we'll start at verse 5. So 4th chapter and verse 5. Clear to the end of the chapter, but I'm not going to go all the way there because the sum total of it is summed up in less than 15 verses. But if you will, here's what's interesting. You can read this in the historical context and only limit it to Jeremiah's time and not see that what is happening in Jeremiah's day is equally true for us. In Jeremiah's time, Jeremiah is told to go out and declare, basically to cry and lament for a city. And I say a city, it's Jerusalem is the place. Supposedly the foundation of peace will become the foundation for a great turmoil in a short period of time. And he's told to go out and, verse 5, declare in Judah and publish in Jerusalem and say, blow ye the trumpet in the land, cry. Cry, gather together, assemble yourselves. And it says, let us go, but flee into the fortified cities. Set up the standard toward Zion, that is, raise the banner up. Retire, stay not, flee, essentially flee for safety without delay. Retire is kind of a poor choice of words. Flee for safety without delay. For I will bring evil from the north and a great destruction. Now you'd say, boy, here's the message. Remember that boiling pot from the beginning is now, the pot is beginning to boil over. It's not yet boiled over, but here comes the initial, if you want to call it the water spray. Here's the warning. The lion has come up from his thicket. The destroyer of the Gentiles of the nations is on his way. Can you imagine being told, you are going to be destroyed, you and your city? I mean, we read this and I don't know that it can ever really sink in unless we're really taking it in the framework of a city or a town. I often think when I read this, I think of our city. And I think of how, I've got to be careful, choose my words here, how sometimes transparently flimsy people are with regard to God. We've got a couple of big churches where people get together. They like to come in with their flip-flops and their coffee cups to hear the pastor in the lounge room. We've got the ever-changing Hollywood populace of celebrities that change their pastor or their religion with the new fad of something. It's very, I think there should be a lament for our city. Some people would say, well, just leave them alone. We can pray for our city. I mean, you may think that's really ridiculous and quite immature, but I don't, considering we're trying to build, and I want the people that God would desire to have here. There's no harm in praying for our city, the city where our church is, and the city that surrounds us, the people, the populace. Now you might say, is this a disconnect? Absolutely not. Because I can tell you, it's much like the time in Jeremiah's day. There was destruction coming. For us, in our perspective place where we are, right here, You know, we have gangland on the one side. We've got an interesting surrounding immediately around the church, and we've never been a community church. Not that I'm looking to be a community church. But I'd say to you, it's interesting. If we're not praying for the things around us, it's just like saying, oh, we don't care. We're just here, and let everything fall where it may. We should be praying for our surroundings and the things around us and the people who surround us, the businesses. You might think that's bizarre, but if those things are thriving and if those people are doing well, that, again, it's like everything else. Our surroundings are important. The church is the most important. But I'm thinking about the people that were being told there is destruction coming. And it's regarding this line, which is that the destroyer, obviously, who God was going to use upon these people. He is gone forth from his place to make thy land desolate, and thy city shall be laid waste without an inhabitant. For this gird you with sackcloth, lament and howl, for the fierce anger of the Lord is not turned back from us. That's a bold statement. It shall come to pass at that day, saith the Lord, that the heart of the king shall perish, and the heart of the princes. The king and his officials will lose heart, and the priest will be horrified, and the prophets shall be appalled. I'm giving you the words I translated as they read in the Hebrew. Then said I, Ah, Lord God, surely thou hast greatly deceived this people and Jerusalem, saying, Ye shall have peace, whereas the sword reacheth unto the soul. Just the sword is literally at their throats. Now, I'm not sure, verse 10, if that is a satire. I'm really not quite sure. It's very hard to piece together in the Hebrew what exactly is intended. But I would perceive, based on how this reads, that there is a sarcasm or a satire when Jeremiah says, how you've greatly deceived this people, because God had forewarned. God had said, I'm going to send this upon the people. So there was no deception. That's why I said it could be a tone of sarcasm. At that time shall it be said to this people in Jerusalem, a dry wind of the high places in the wilderness toward the daughter of my people, not to fan nor to cleanse. Sounds pretty bad. Even a full wind from those places shall come unto me. Now also will I give sentence against them. Again, we have that legal tone right there of some indictment against the people with the impending doom, the judgment. Behold, he shall come up as clouds. His chariot shall be as a whirlwind. His horses are swifter than eagles. Woe unto us, for we are spoiled, we're ruined. Now, if you think all this is bad, and it is bad, but you can always find God is always throwing out a beacon of light somewhere. You've got to look for it. Somebody said, well, this chapter is pretty gloomy. But listen, within this whole diatribe that's being put forth, verse 14, O Jerusalem, wash thine heart from wickedness, that thou mayest be saved. You think about that. Right in the midst of telling the people utter destruction, here is a wind that's going to come that is going to be so parching to the soul. Swords are at the throat of the people. Doom, impossible to escape. And yet, O Jerusalem, wash thine heart from wickedness, that thou mayest be saved. And I thought, you know, it's interesting that God would put that one potential turning point for the people to hear if they could. But they couldn't. Now, that was Jeremiah's day. I say there are still people today who are able to hear and receive what the Spirit, just like the churches of Revelation, what the Spirit saith unto the churches. There's still time for people today. You may say, well, this is a tough thing because doom was certain, but I think if the people repented, maybe something else. Maybe it would have been prolonged. Maybe a greater time would have occurred. I don't know. I know God gave a specific timeline for the people to be carried away, and that is certain. That had to come out the way it did. I mean, God said it. He foretold it by the prophet. It had to happen. It had to come to pass. But could it have come down differently? Perhaps. But the people did not. And by the way, they could not wash their heart from wickedness. We have a better way. This is what I love about this. If you just stopped here and you carry this into today, Jeremiah's lament for a city And yet there's still the thread there of the possibility of washing yourself from the wickedness of your ways. Now, the people couldn't, but we today, looking unto Christ, can. So we may weep and lament for our city. I remember while we were downtown, and I remember saying how, to me, while people were talking about the city downtown coming to its maybe, we'll say, former glory, or maybe better than it was, I'm not quite sure. I was thinking, but even if the buildings are built, and even if the businesses are, if there is no spiritual life there, it's always going to be dead. If there is no spiritual life, if there is no spiritual connectivity. I mean, Dr. Scott said all the Protestant churches had fled. Well, downtown, the only church that seems to thrive is the Catholic Church, and has thrived for many, many years. Now, we did, and I think my circle of people around me, especially the staff people, prayed earnestly before any decisions were made. But I'm looking now at where we are, and I'm thinking, you know what? We should be lamenting for our city. We can act as if we're just some little isolated island and nothing else matters, and cease to pray for the things around us. And you could spend all your day praying for the people around you till you're blue in the face, and that may not change anything, but God does hear our prayers. He knows what's on our heart and what's important to us. So I labeled this A Lament for a City and the Last Call, because verse 14 tells me God was still putting out the possibility, but the people would not. If you read down verse 22, it's pretty bold. For my people is foolish, they have not known me. Think about that. Think about right there, as Jeremiah is declaring this, God is saying through his mouth, my people have not known me. That's why it's important for me to do what I do through the Word. That's the only way we get to know God. You can say, well, I would like to have a Spirit-filled experience. Well, before you have any type of experience, you're never going to get to know about who God is. You can have floating experiences all your life until you get to know God through His Word, see His ways, know about Him through what He has revealed. You're going to be very far off and far away. Now, He says here, for my people is foolish, they have not known me. They are sottish children. Then they have none understanding, no capacity to receive my words, no capacity. They are wise to do evil, but to do good they have no knowledge. That's kind of frightening. Coming from God. They have not known me, they don't have a capacity. They only know how to do evil. They don't even know or understand how to do good. And you get the rest of the gist of this chapter is going to basically build on this. But the premise for this, verses 5 through 31, and you can read through the rest of it, but the main core of this is a lament for a city, the last call, which is verse 14, and then from God's perspective, verse 22 about His people. Now I pray that we take this not only as an understanding of this chapter, but an understanding of to not be foolish, to not be those without understanding. Pray for understanding. So you may say, well, it's kind of gloomy. Not really, if you think about it. In spite of all that the people did, in spite of all the ways they departed from God, in spite of everything, God still was putting that last call out, if you will. And I love this because if you'll turn to the end of chapter 5 and verse 31, the very last verse of that chapter, you read, it says, and what will you do in the end thereof? And I love that because as I was reading that, some folks would read and say, wow, that's like one of those old-time messages where people would say, are you ready for the end? But friends, the end isn't the end. The end is the beginning. The end is not the end. The end is the beginning. I don't care what you believe. The end of your life here begins eternity, whether it's in heaven or in hell. That's a different story. Now, between this jump of a chapter I could fill in the blanks and say how the people didn't and how the people didn't. But between the blank of what we just heard and what we know, I could ask you the same thing. Not because I'm trying to scare people into the kingdom. I don't believe that works, and I'm not interested in it. I'm just asking some of us today to ask the question, what will we do at the end? And the end is not the end. The end is not the end, but the beginning for every creature on the planet. When the end of this flesh comes, the beginning of eternity begins in its fullest form. What will you do? Will you be like those that Jesus says, depart from me, I never knew you? Will you be the ones where God says, enter in, thou good and faithful servant, well done? In between, well, maybe a chapter and a half in the Bible, and for us, a lifetime. So I love this book because I can go back and forth from the historic to the now. And I take every single word in here and I think, you know, probably if people were reading this book without seeing, gosh, it's depressing, wow, God's saying he's going to do this. But in spite of God saying all this, he still threw out the possibility. In fact, chapter by chapter, you'll find those beacons and those cords, if you will, those red cords, those scarlet cords that God is still throwing out as lifelines to the people. But none would take it. So it's a good lesson for us to read it, to label it, so when you go back to study it, you can at least get a bird's eye view. And as we go through this, like I said, perhaps there'll be places where I want to camp out. The biggest thing for me has been looking at this, not to try and line it up chronologically, but to look at it in a full perspective, that God called a person for an impossible task, impossible and seemingly demoralizing. Because do you read that he made any great converts? Do you read that he had mass multitudes following him as they threw him into the pit? No. And much like Christ going to the cross alone, Jeremiah in the pit, Paul in prison, these are the real heroes of faith. It's a lonely journey, and the true faithers find themselves right here on the pages of this book saying, I take the example, I take the lesson, and I keep walking and pursuing God's way through his word. So we'll chisel away chapter by chapter. I'm liking this because I hope yours starts to look like mine. Mine has color and markings and all kinds of interesting scribbles I can barely read anymore, but it's fun. I'm enjoying the journey through Jeremiah. I hope you are too. Get on the telephone.
Come into his house, magnify the Lord, worship and bow down before him, exalt his name today. Come